Is this thing on? Okay, I think so. Um, Hello, and welcome to our yeah our discussion of Zeynep Tufekci's "The Democracy Poisoning: Golden Age of Free Speech." I let's see. Can I move this window? Okay. Um, this is the first reading of the semester, and it's going to be paired with a second reading to come shortly. But before we get to the second reading and the paper assignment that will along with the two readings, we have first to make sure we get this one, and there's going to be a quiz on it. Now, shortly after this video posts, I'll post the specific information about how the quiz will work. I have the quiz, the questions, and I'm going to, instead of just sort of posting the questions, I'm going to use the quiz feature on Canvas to administer it. But before we get to that, in an in-person basic comp class, we'd obviously have a day of discussion of a reading before we had the quiz. And so we had a discussion forum where you guys gave some very interesting thoughts on the nature of the feedback loop that Tufekci talks about early in the piece. And that's a good starting point for thinking about her argument as a whole here. Zeynep Tufekci is a professor of media at the University of North Carolina, and she sort of specializes in online discourse and the way that social media shapes public opinion and the way that disinformation kind of circulates in the social media landscape. And she's a big advocate for the idea that social media companies like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, well, Facebook and Instagram are one company, but how the platforms need to do a better job moderating their content. And she sees it really as an issue of the health of democracy. And I can't highlight. Please tell me I can highlight. Okay, I can highlight. I just can't highlight. All right. Let's start with the title. It's The Democracy Poisoning: Golden Age of Free Speech. That in and of itself is sort of almost feels self-contradictory, because we think of free speech, right, as being an essential element of democracy. And here in this title, Tufekci is already laying the groundwork for the argument that there might be something about the nature of speech, the nature of the way we think of free speech in the digital age, that is actually harmful to democracy. And of course, in the course of the article, she gets to talking about how free speech is important, but also there are other things that are important as well that we can't lose sight of. Obviously, you all know that free speech is a something. It's both a legal idea and a specific aspect of the Constitution, right? The protections of free speech come from the First Amendment of the Constitution, as you all know, right? Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, or preventing the free exercise thereof, or abridging the rights of the press, a speech, or the press, or the rights of the people to peaceably assemble, etc. So, all those rights that we get in the First Amendment, freedom of speech is usually the first one we think of. But we already know that it's not absolute, right? Free speech is not unlimited, even under the First Amendment, even in a quote unquote free society like we live in today. And certainly we have a lot more freedom than people did 500 years ago, say. But and in many other countries today, when it comes to free discourse, right? When it comes to free speech. But it's still not absolute, right? There are some things you can't say still. For example, you can't threaten somebody with violence. You can't, the classic one is you can't shout fire in a movie theater, right? Those things are considered harmful behavior, reckless behavior, and you can be punished for those things. You can be arrested, you can be charged with a crime. And there are other things as well that limit free speech. Libel, right? Which is purposely untrue written speech designed intentionally to harm somebody, right? There are laws against libel. There are laws against slander, right? So although it's really hard to prosecute those things, right? Uh, you can write a lot of untrue things about somebody and still be protected by the law. It's only under a narrow set of circumstances where libel laws come into play. Nevertheless, the point here is that we do believe in the concept of free speech, but even we as a society accept that there are certain limits on speech, even under the auspices of free speech. And as long as you don't have absolute free speech, as long as there are these limitations, there's always going to be a kind of argument or debate simmering in a culture, in a society, about where the line should be drawn and what is okay and what isn't okay, right? So in the United States, we have a very, 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 very permissive attitude when it comes to speech. There is very little. I mean, we're, as far as countries go, when it comes to speech, the United States is perhaps the most liberal in the classical sense of allowing the most. In Europe, even, Europe is full of liberal democracies, right? They have many more rules against things like hate speech than the United States does, right? In the United States, you're free to say hateful things. You're free to be a bigot. You're free to promote whatever harmful ideology, Nazi ideology. No one's going to stop you. Legally, they can't. And there are other ways to stop somebody, but legally, you can engage in hate speech. It's not a crime in the United States. It is a crime, or it is legally sanctioned in other countries. Germany, for instance, it's against the law to promote Nazi ideology for obvious reasons. So even amongst Western liberal democracies, there's a sort of difference in terms of what is and is not allowed. So Tufekci calls our current age the golden age of free speech. And the reasons for that are probably obvious. How is this the golden age of free speech? Well, as Tufekci says, it's because we live in a culture in which everybody has access to a platform in which they can broadly disseminate their views. The internet, right? Social media, online platforms, right? And so she begins the article with this sort of contrast between the way things used to be when it came to broadcast technology and the way they are today. So she has this anecdote about the soccer game and the announcer, the military junta or whatever is afraid that the announcer is going to say things they don't want him to say. So to control the messaging, they just hold a gun to the announcer's head for the whole game, right? To stop him from broadcasting coup idea, sentiments to the broader populace. Because in the days of traditional broadcast media, you had what she calls a bottleneck, right? Where's that word? Bottleneck. Here it is. Come on, what's with the highlighting here? I was just highlighting. I don't know. My Chromebook's finicky. After all, there was only one announcer to threaten a single bottleneck to control of the airwaves. And hopefully you all understand what she means by this idea of a bottleneck. A bottleneck is a point in a system which it narrows, and everything has to pass through a sort of narrow point. In the case of broadcast technology, right? You have this bottleneck wherein everything must go through the network, right? The point in the system in which the information is actually broadcast out, right? And there are, to broadcast something on television or the radio, you need cameras, or you need microphones, cameras, you need broadcast equipment, you need all kinds of stuff, right? So not everybody can do it. So you have this bottleneck, which is the single point from which information can be broadly disseminated. And what Tufekci says is that in a system like that, it's easy to engage in censorship because you only have to control that one point. So you don't have to break everybody's television set or break everybody's radio. You just have to hold a gun to the head of the one broadcaster to stop the flow of information you don't want. That's the bottleneck. And what she says is that now it's different, right? We certainly still have bottlenecks in a sense, right? But the idea that information is now, or the wide dissemination of information is now only available to companies that have all sorts of expensive equipment is no longer the case, right? Today, that playbook is all but obsolete. Whose throat do you squeeze when anyone can set up a Twitter account in seconds, and when almost any event is recorded by smartphone wielding members of the public? And we've seen how important this is in the social landscape. The idea that everybody can broadcast, right? You have a cell phone, you have Twitter, and you see something, you can broadcast it to a broad audience as long as you can capture that attention, right? And she talks about Ferguson, Missouri. We, of course, can think about what's going on today with the George Floyd protests, right, and the Black Lives Matter movement more generally. How important citizen cell phone quote unquote broadcasts are to triggering social change or social movements. In today's network environment, where when anyone can broadcast live or post their thoughts to a social network, it would seem that censorship ought to be impossible. This should be the golden age of free speech. I don't know why that word's tiny. But that's only part of it, right? And what Tufekci goes on to talk about is that, yes, in one sense, it's a golden age of free speech, but the problem is that we've become sort of awash in information of dubious quality, right? It's much harder than ever before to tell the difference between what is real and what is not, what is true and what is false, what is worth paying attention to and what isn't, right? And also, right, that we have ceded control from big broadcast corporations, right, to internet companies, to social media giants, to Facebook and Google and the like, right? And that the people who run those platforms, be they Mark Zuckerberg or whoever else, have different incentives than we do as both creators of discourse and consumers of discourse. And what are their motives? What does a social media platform want? Well, they want your engagement and your attention. And they don't necessarily care how they get it, or maybe things are starting to change. This article was written in 2016, so it was really the beginning of a pressure campaign that's been going on for a few years now. And now you start to see, right, social media companies doing more when it comes to labeling false information or whatever, stuff like that. But at the time Tufekci wrote this article in 2016, it was pretty much still the Wild West. So let's sort of take a step back for a second. So now, instead of expensive broadcasting equipment and a few companies having the ability to broadcast widely, now we all have a sort of access point to quote unquote broadcast infrastructure via these social media and internet companies, right? And what do they want? They want to make money. How do they make money? Through advertising. How do you make money through advertising? By having a lot of people clicking and a lot of people engaged, right? As she says, these media companies, at their core, their business is mundane. They're ad brokers. To virtually anyone who wants to pay them, they sell the capacity to precisely target our eyeballs. They use massive surveillance of our behavior online and off to generate increasingly accurate automated predictions of what advertisements we are most susceptible to and what content will keep us clicking, tapping, and scrolling down a bottomless feed. And we've all experienced this, right? Where social media has this pull on you, and it's kind of hard to break away. And some of what you're engaging with on social media is a result of your contacts, who you know, who you frequently engage with, etc. But a lot of it is also generated by these algorithmic processes, right? Especially the advertising. And you've all probably noticed that, you send an email about buying a new, I don't know, mountain bike or whatever, and the next thing you know, you've got mountain bike ads all over your social media feed, right? They're using your attention, your engagement, to direct you to advertising that will enrich them, right? So where does the truth come in all this? Mark Zuckerberg has very little incentive to police content as long as it's keeping you engaged. And that's what Tufekci gets to in this next paragraph, right? Facebook and YouTube are optimized for engagement. In other words, what will get you clicking and what will keep you there? And, you know, YouTube is a pretty good example, right? YouTube, at least a few years ago, was inundated with all kinds of conspiracy theories and videos promoting wild ideas about whether it's flat Earth or anti-vaxxers or the evil cabal that runs the Federal Reserve. YouTube doesn't care as long as you find it interesting and you're watching it. That's all YouTube cares about. And the same thing for Facebook, right? They're optimized for engagement. In other words, they're designed to keep you clicking, keep you engaged. Now, here's more. You like this video? Here's more videos you might like. Are they true? Are they fake? Who knows? We don't care. Just click. That brings us to the passage that I asked you to write about, right? When it comes to the social validation feedback loop. And this is this is one of the most probably important paragraphs in the reading when it comes to understanding what Tufekci is trying to say here, right? And I want to engage in a little bit of close reading. Now, close reading is a skill that is kind of at the heart of what we do in the writing program at Rutgers. It's extremely important in XPOS. So we want to start now thinking about close reading as a process. And what it is basically is you look at the words and the phrases that an author uses. You look at the constituent elements of a passage from a work to try to come to a deeper understanding of that passage, right? In other words, let me put that a little bit better. Paying close attention to the language that an author uses in an attempt to say something insightful about it. That's all that close reading is. So let's take a look at this. Again, this is the passage that I put on the forum, and you guys had some interesting things to say. But humans are a social species equipped with few defenses against the natural world beyond our ability to acquire knowledge and stay in groups that work together. We are particularly susceptible to glimmers of novelty, messages of affirmation and belonging, and messages of outrage toward perceived enemies. These kinds of messages are to human community what salt, sugar, and fat are to the human appetite. Now let's break this down here, okay? And this is where, just having a one-way video is suboptimal compared to having a discussion where I would like to ask you and hear you respond. But let's not worry about what we don't have now. Let's think about what we do have. We're susceptible, means we're vulnerable to glimmers of novelty. What does that mean? Glimmers of novelty. Novelty is something that's new or unusual that you haven't seen before. So when you come across information or media that you think, well, I've never seen that before, right? Somebody promises you, watch this crazy video, watch what happens to this guy, watch what this animal does, etc. Right? We love that. We love the promise of something that we haven't seen before. So we're susceptible to glimmers of novelty. Is the video real? Is it a setup? Is that, sometimes, most of the time, yes, probably, but sometimes no. But more importantly, is it information that's of value to us? Not really, except to the extent that it entertains us for a minute or two. So glimmers of novelty, that which is new or interesting. Also, we are susceptible to, and this adjective, susceptible, governs this whole list. These are all things that we as a species are vulnerable to. Our brains are naturally drawn to these kinds of messages. So glimmers of novelty, messages of affirmation and belonging. This is another thing we love, and this is what social media specializes in. What does that mean? Well, things that make us feel like we are part of something or that we are on the right side of something. This is why political social media is such a big thing, right? People love to feel they're right, and they like to feel like they're on the right team or the winning team. So you're a Democrat, and you surround yourselves with other Democrats, and you feel like you belong to the right side of history, and you are very pleased by messages which reinforce your belief in your own rightness, whether you're left wing, right wing, whatever. I find that this is a big deal. This has become more and more uh, impossible to avoid. People going to social media to find reinforcement for their ideological beliefs, and we're all guilty of it. I'm not pointing fingers at anybody, right? Um, so affirmation, you're right, belonging, you're part of this group, right? And it's not just politics too. It's also like, I mean, if you're in a any kind of social media group, discourse that makes you feel like part of a group, part of a community, is we like that, and that's hardwired into our brains. Human beings are naturally drawn to seek out community, to seek out cooperation, right? It's why we've survived as a species. So when Tufekci talks in an almost anthropological way about what our brains respond to, that's what she means. And we also, like, the flip side of that, we also are susceptible to messages of outrage toward perceived enemies. And I'm sure you can all figure out what she means here, right? You hate Donald Trump? Well, here's 15 anti-Trump memes in your feed today to make you feel good about hating Donald Trump, or whoever, right? Or same thing, of course, if you love Donald Trump, but that's the other side of the, hate Hillary Clinton. The internet was awash in anti-Hillary Clinton memes back in 2016, which is something that Tufekci actually touches on, right? Those are very powerful messages that are directing harm or anger towards our perceived enemies. It doesn't even have to be as serious as politics. You hate the Red Sox, you hate, the Golden State Warriors, right? Whatever. You like to see people making fun of them. Here's content for you. And when we get to I forget the name of the author. Is it not Renner, not Twenge? Well, regardless, this idea of outrage towards perceived enemies is something that's going to come up in future readings as well. Like how the internet becomes a kind of breeding ground for driving hatred towards certain groups. Not always the ones you'd think of either. And we all have the whack jobs in our social media feeds, right? But it's amazing the way that messages of outrage towards perceived enemies draw people in and make them feel like part of something in fearing or hating another, right? Real or made up, whether it's a different race, a different gender, a different ethnic group, or whether it's something as fantastical as like a secret cabal, like I said, of conspirators, right? People are naturally drawn to those kinds of messages. So those are the three kinds of messages that Tufekci talks about as being vulnerable to: glimmers of novelty, affirmation and belonging, outrage towards perceived enemies. And she likens them to salt, sugar, and fat, right? Those are to our brains what salt, sugar, and fat are to our appetite. What are those things? Well, they're the things we crave that make us happy. Salt, sugar, and fat, right? But are those things that are good for you in certain amounts? Sure. To the excess of everything else? No. And Facebook gorges us on them. So just shoves a never-ending stream of this delicious content into our mouths, and we can't resist it. And Sean Parker calls this the social validation feedback loop. And you guys all seem to get this, right? What he meant here. That social media is a place you can go to feel good about yourself, either from getting likes or participating in a like-minded community, right? Having your own beliefs reverberated back at you in this feedback loop that just makes them stronger and stronger. And the real challenge then is breaking out, right? Exposing yourself to different viewpoints, different ideologies. But that's difficult, right? Because we're all naturally drawn to surround ourselves with like-minded people promoting like-minded ideological perspectives. And we get angry when we see something that challenges that belief. And there are no nutrition labels in this cafeteria. A great line, which harkens back to the salt, sugar, fat thing. What that means is a nutrition label tells you whether what you're eating is healthy or unhealthy. On the internet, information has no labels, right? So you don't know whether you're consuming is good for you or not. Now, like I said, Twitter and Facebook have started to do more quote unquote labeling. And I've seen this. I have this one wacky person in my feed who I've long since unfollowed, but every once in a while I check in on them, and a lot of times their posts get these labels, right? Because they're posting anti-vaccine stuff or, you know, whatever weird holistic nonsense that is they love to peddle. I don't know. So, there's a question of what responsibility does the social media platform itself have to make sure that the information that is hosted on its platforms is true or healthy or valuable. Now, for a long time, the position of Facebook and Twitter was that it's not their job to police content outside of some very obvious things, right? But Tufekci clearly disagrees, right? She thinks that there is a role that the platforms themselves have to play and that we as a society have to engage in order to reassert the idea that, yes, truth is important, quality of information is important, not just free speech, not just letting people say whatever they want, whenever they want to, as wide an audience as possible, but actually making some tough trade-offs on the question of assigning value to speech. And it starts to sound a little scary and a little dystopian because we very much shy away from the idea that anybody should be controlling our speech, right? Or that censorship is a bad thing. Is censorship a bad thing if it's blocking the spread of something that's untrue or harmful? Again, some people would say, yeah, it's still harmful. It's still bad, even if it does that. But that's the debate, right? Let's move down a little bit here. So down on page, I guess this is page 4. Yeah, page 4. Where'd you go? Tufekci invokes this idea of the marketplace of ideas, which was how this is supposed. If you're a free speech absolutist and you say, well, no matter how wacky or wrong or whatever the speech is, don't censor it, let it out into the world to be defeated by better ideas, right? The truth will win out. That's what the marketplace of ideas suggests, right? Many of the most noble ideas about free speech simply don't compute in the age of social media. John Stuart Mill's notion that a, quote, marketplace of ideas will elevate the truth is flatly belied by the virality of fake news. So, in the old days, John Stuart Mill, back in the 19th century, said, coined this idea, the marketplace of ideas. Oh, let everybody say what they want, let everybody promote whatever ideas they want, and the best ideas will win out. It's an idea borrowed from market ideology of economics, right? Don't have strict controls over commerce. Just let the market work itself out. The invisible hand of the market works better than any government control. Well, what is Tufekci saying here? It doesn't work in the age of the internet. It's flatly belied by the virality of fake news. A great phrase, a really good phrase. I often think about this, that the marketplace of ideas is belied by the virality of fake news. But again, some close reading. What does that mean? Belied means sort of contradicted or undone, right? The virality of fake news. What is it that spreads around the internet in the blink of an eye? Is it the truth? I guess sometimes. But truth or falsity is sort of irrelevant to something's virality. What predicts content's virality? It's how interesting it is and how good it is at garnering our attention. And that is not always the truth. In fact, it seems like fake news spreads more easily and more quickly than real news, in part because it isn't bound to the dictates of reality. If you can come up with something plausible that's really interesting, it can go viral, whether it's true or not. And that therein is the counterweight to the marketplace of ideas thing. What's winning out in the digital age? Is truth winning out, or is virality, is clickability winning out? Right? Is the information's ability to garner our attention winning out over truth? Yes, it is. And it's becoming difficult for truth to cut through the nonsense. And here's the example I often get, right? we often think of human discourse or knowledge as being on this kind of upward trajectory. When I was a teenager, way back in the 1990s, right before you guys, most of you were born now, I graduated high school in 1998. All right, I went to Rutgers from 98 to 2002. So we're closing in. We've done my 20th of my. Sorry, we're closing in on the 20th anniversary of my graduation, which is a little depressing. Um, but back in the 90s, um, I had never heard of a flat earther. There were no flat earthers, right? There was like 5 guys in Wyoming maybe who believed in a flat earth. Um, and as crazy as it is, as nonsensical as it is, flat eartherism is one of those things that's on the rise in the digital age. At least it was as of a couple of years ago. You have celebrity proponents of the idea, right? You've got you can find them all over Twitter, right? All over Facebook, even these flat earther. I don't know what to call them. Conspiracists. They believe that the round Earth is like this big conspiracy. I don't know. Maybe you've never been exposed to it, whatever. But there are at least thousands and thousands of them. Whereas back in the 90s, there were almost none. How did this happen? Well, it happened because the social media and YouTube provided a platform in which these crazy kinds of conspiracies could take root and flourish. And it's not just that. The anti-vax movement. There were no anti-vaxxers. I mean, there were, I'm sure, in the 90s. A few, crunchy granola parents or whatever. But vaccine trutherism, I don't know what to call it exactly, is something that bloomed in the age of the internet, of social media. There have always been skeptics, even back with the polio vaccine first came out in the 50s. Walter Winchell, the famous sort of radio broadcaster, went on the air and created a panic and said that the polio vaccine was going to kill kids. There have always been these voices of dissent when it comes to vaccine, but nothing like the huge organized movement that exists today that is almost entirely driven by social media posting. Flat earthers, anti-vaxxers, who knows what'll be next? Let's just wait and see. What conspiracy du jour will become popular. QAnon, which is I can't even joke about because it's too frightening, right? QAnon is something that could not have existed before social media. There were too many controls, too many bottlenecks in the flow of information for such an outlandish conspiracy to gain wide purchase. But now it's a conspiracy theory that's working its way even into the upper echelons of our own government. Do we have a duty to stop people from spreading QAnon conspiracies, or does free speech mean they have a right to say what they want to say and, let the marketplace of ideas sort it out? That's kind of the debate. And now Tufekci says, I'm not saying get rid of all digital discourse. It's not a call for nostalgia, right? There are a lot of good things about the way information flows now in terms of promoting, marginalized voices, having a seat at the table, etc. But basically, what she says is we have to get away from this idea that free speech is the only thing that matters. There are other things that matter too. What that speech is doing for democracy is a question that we have to face. All right, so here, bottom of page, just 5, very bottom of page 4. Now, let's actually let's go to do this one. Top of page 5 here. So in this previous paragraph here, she talks about how it's not just good messages that get spread, right? You can there's messages that fuel ethnic cleansing, all kinds of horrible things that also can be widely disseminated on the internet, right? And here's a kind of nut graph where another one that's worth close reading, right? The freedom of speech is an important democratic value, but it's not the only one. In the liberal tradition, small l, so not in our sense of liberal, but just in the democratic tradition, right? Free speech is usually understood as a vehicle, a necessary condition for achieving certain other societal ideals. So free speech is not the thing you're trying to get to. free speech is something that gets you somewhere else. We need free speech so that we can have other things, like what? Creating a knowledgeable public, engendering healthy, rational, and informed debate, for holding powerful people and institutions accountable. The press is a big part of that, also protected by the First Amendment. Keeping communities lively and vibrant, the arts, etc. What we are seeing now is that when free speech is treated as an end and not a means, it is all too possible to thwart and distort everything it is supposed to deliver. An end as opposed to a means. You know what she means by that? What is the difference between an end and a means? Now, here in the classroom, we'd have a back and forth discussion while we figured it out, but because this is a video, I will tell you an end, right? Maybe an end is somewhere you're trying to get. A means is something that gets you there, right? The same as when she mentioned a vehicle before, right? Free speech is not an end in and of itself. It's a means towards other things, a healthy democracy. If your free speech is not promoting a healthy democracy, but instead undermining that democracy by allowing the uncontrolled spread of dangerous misinformation, do we need to rethink the nature of free speech itself? Creating a knowledgeable public requires at least some workable signals that distinguish truth from falsehood. Fostering a healthy, rational, and informed debate in a mass society requires mechanisms that elevate opposing viewpoints, preferably their best versions. To be clear, no public sphere has ever fully achieved these ideal conditions, but at least they were ideals to fail from. Today's engagement algorithms, right, our social media networks, by contrast, espouse no ideals about a healthy public sphere. The internet doesn't care about democracy or a healthy public sphere. It just wants you to keep engaged, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever. So let's stop trusting them to be the arbiters of our information. If their motivations and goals are different than ours as a democratic society, let's remember that free speech, according to Tufekci at least, free speech is a means towards other things. If free speech is not getting you those other things, then you need to rethink the nature of speech itself and how it is disseminated and how it is controlled. And that's a scary thing. As she says, it involves fixing this problem, involves trade-offs. Where's that word? Let me use control. Where's she talking about trade-offs? Yeah. Okay. Trade-offs. There are few solutions to the problems of digital discourse that don't involve huge trade-offs. What's a trade-off? It means you have to give up something to get something. And in this case, what Tufekci means is we might have to consider giving up a little bit of freedom to have a healthier democracy. Again, I'm not saying Tufekci is right and you should believe everything that Tufekci is saying, but we do have to understand what Tufekci is saying. Free speech is a means towards something and not an end in and of itself. We have the Constitution is more than just the First Amendment. There is, for instance, the 14th Amendment, that the Equal Protection Amendment, right? If speech is putting groups or individuals in danger, do we have a case where the First and 14th Amendments are in conflict, etc.? There's not. You can't just think, oh, free speech, good. That's what Tufekci's saying. You have to think of what controls do we need on speech to ensure that free speech is doing what it's supposed to be doing in our open society. And the analogy she uses is the car in this last paragraph. Facebook is only 13 years old, Twitter 11, Google is but 19. Yeah. Google, this is 2016, so yeah, Google got its start right around the time I was starting at Rutgers. I remember the first time I saw Google was in my Intro to Computer Science class at my freshman year of Rutgers. That's how old I am. At this moment in the evolution of the auto industry, there are still no seatbelts, airbags, emission controls, or mandatory crumple zones. The rules and incentive structures underlying how attention and surveillance work on the internet need to change. What's the point of this? Why is she invoking cars here? Okay, when cars were only 13 years old, there were no seatbelts, there were no mandatory crumple zones, no airbags, no emission controls, no rear backup camera, no blind spot warnings. What's happening to cars as the industry evolves? Well, they're getting more safety, more safeguards, and more controls. Some of that is because of consumer demand. People want safe cars, right? But could you make a car without a seatbelt today? No. Well, you could make one, you couldn't sell it, right? Why not? Yeah, because of the law, right? By law, cars have to have these things now. These are a minimum legal requirement for automobile manufacturing: airbags, seatbelts, etc. Every car now has that backup camera, I think, right? I think. I haven't seen one without it in a while. Not every car on the road, but every new car that gets sold, I mean. So what's happening? We're giving up a little bit of freedom, the freedom to drive a car without a seatbelt or not wear a seatbelt, or the freedom for an auto manufacturer to sell whatever kind of car they want in exchange for greater safety. And what has brought this about? Public demand, but also regulation, right? The government putting down rules that say you can do this, you can't do that. And the implication seems to be that Tufekci wants us to consider what kinds of trade-offs we might be willing to make when it comes to discourse. Now, she doesn't give any specific, there's no specific solutions offered here. She just says we have to have the conversation, right? There are a few solutions to the problem of digital discourse that don't involve huge trade-offs, and those are not choices for Mark Zuckerberg alone to make. These are deeply political decisions. In the 20th century, the U.S. passed laws that outlawed lead paint and gasoline, lead in paint and gasoline, that defined how much privacy a landlord needs to give his tenants, and that determined how much a phone company can surveil its customers. Right? We've put all kinds of restrictions on what people who sell stuff or offer services can and can't do. Right? Whether it's gasoline, car manufacturing, your landlord, or your phone company. We can decide how we want to handle digital surveillance, attention channeling, harassment, data collection, and algorithmic decision making. We just need to start the discussion now. So this article is really an invitation for you to begin thinking about trade-offs between free speech and healthy speech, right? Between a culture that perhaps is willing to say, well, we don't want that kind of stuff floating around. We want to make sure that the information that is reaching us is of a certain quality. And we don't want to be at the mercy of these giant corporations who only want to harness our attention so that they can profit from it. So that's it for talking to Tufekci for now. I am going to throw this video online, give you guys some chance to watch it, and then the end of the week, before by Friday, I will put up the instructions for quiz number 1, which will just be some questions about this reading, some of which are going to be drawn from this discussion, some of which will be left to you to figure out, but you'll do fine. All right, just the first one anyway, and you'll be able to take it open book. You have the reading out in front of you and all that. Anyway, more on that to come. But for now, let me stop this and let's get to posting, okay? All right. How do I stop it?